That's why some of our negotiators are here, and we wanted this particular conversation. This is more like a conversation, not really, a series of presentations and then no time for discussion. We would like to make it as interactive as possible. So let's just give ourselves 1 or 2 more minutes, and if they don't come, we'll start anyway. I think after that warm hug from Anna, it's right time to start. So welcome everybody. As I said, this is going to be a conversation about what happened at the Glasgow Dialogue, what have we really achieved, and what next. Journey from here to Sharm el-Sheikh. Before we start that conversation, we would like to share this video with you.
The present is already catastrophic. The present is already scary. If we fail to address loss and damage, the future will be much worse. This is loss and damage. It's what happens when climate change intensified disasters like hurricanes, wildfires and floods, and slow-moving catastrophes like droughts and sea level rise lead to a loss of life, culture, biodiversity, territory, and livelihoods, as well as damage to homes, hospitals, schools and roads, which often forces people to flee their homes.
Loss and damage as of 2022 is taking place in every single country in the world, including rich countries, but the impacts are mostly on poor people in the poor countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America.
If your island is going underwater, you have to move. If your farmland is turning into desert, you have to leave. If forest fires are destroying your home, what choice do you have?
In 2020, we saw heavy rainfall causing 4 rivers to burst their banks in the western part of Uganda, causing massive destruction and leaving over 100,000 people displaced.
In the global negotiations on climate change, in the Paris Agreement in 2015, Article 8 was agreed to tackle loss and damage. But since then, not a single penny has been made available for the victims of loss and damage from climate change.
And this is a problem, because areas prone to loss and damage are no longer insurable.
Insurance is something that works on probability. When you know that you are definitely going to be impacted by climate change, insurance doesn't work.
Therefore, money for people to put their lives back together needs to come from somewhere else.
Those who are at the front lines are the least responsible for the climate crisis. I do believe in the polluter pays principle. Fossil fuel companies and the biggest polluting countries have the responsibility to provide compensation for loss and damage.
The major fossil fuel companies around the world
have known for decades that they were producing a polluting product, and they have suppressed that information and they prevented action. As a result, they've made billions of dollars of profit. Therefore, they are completely liable to be challenged now to pay up for the loss and damage
that they have knowingly caused amongst poor people in poor countries in particular.
Although there is clearly a pressing need to support communities impacted by loss and damage, finance has been blocked, denied, and deemed too expensive by those who have polluted.
The global north hasn't done anything about loss and damage because it has refused to accept responsibility for the climate crisis. They don't want to pay the bill.
With similar compensation funds already in existence, it is high time to set one up for loss and damage.
We do have an example of compensation for pollution. The major oil companies all have a fund that they put money into where if there's an oil spill, those who have been affected can claim compensation without having to prove which company caused the damage. And that's what we need for loss and damage from climate change.
The present is already catastrophic. The present is already scary. And if compensation is not given, the future is going to be much worse.
COP26 failed to deliver finance for loss and damage. We need to build momentum from Glasgow to COP27 to secure finance for loss and damage once and for all.
From the perspective of vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries, COP26 failed to deliver finance for loss and damage. For the people at the front lines who need that money now, we expect COP27 to deliver it.
COP27 will only be successful if a compensation fund is put in place for communities that are facing the impacts of the climate crisis right now.
We have been waiting and waiting for the last 30 years, and we cannot wait any longer.
If we do not address loss and damage, then there is no climate justice.
It's not just what loss and damage is, but what it means. It speaks of the existential threat that the heating of our fragile band of atmosphere represents. It's the signpost of what's to come. The alarm bell that tells us we are running out of road for ignoring it as if it isn't there. We are running out of road for doing nothing proportionate to the scale of the problem. We are running out of road. Taking care of those at the sharp end of this climate change that is happening now, not tomorrow, but now, is urgent and long overdue.
Would like to acknowledge Stamp Out Poverty for making this film and also Heinrich Böll Stiftung. So we have Liane here as the Associate Director of Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Washington, DC, and Make Polluters Pay, who made effort to make this. This is the second version of this movie to generate awareness because people kept asking of, and even until now, thankfully not now anymore. So they kept asking what is loss and damage. So we had to have a film to explain what exactly it is. And we have Salim here, who prominently features. We had Vanessa Nakate here in the previous week, campaigning and demanding loss and damage finance facility. And I would like to very warmly welcome Ambassador Nabil from Pakistan, who is the chair of G77 in China. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. And if I can also acknowledge a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change with Asian Fry in the audience. We very much would like to keep it interactive and, as I said, not really a series of presentation. The idea, and I'm Harjeet Singh from Climate Action Network. The idea is to really reflect collectively on what happened last week and how we are now going to take it forward. Negotiations are not over yet. We are still fighting for this issue to be taken to COP27. So not to put you on spot, but we would like to hear your reflections on, to start with you, on what happened, because we know G77 and China played such an important role at COP26 by demanding loss and damage finance facility. And just to remind you all that G77 and China means 85% of world's population. And we all know how developing countries are facing the brunt of climate impacts in the form of extreme weather events, slow onset events like sea level rise, glacier melt. And there is no system in the current financial architecture to support people. Not a single penny has flown from this system to help people recover from climate impacts. And there's a huge gap in terms of responding to these impacts, helping people recover from these disasters, helping them rebuild their lives, supporting them in relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction. There's nothing that's happening from this system. So that's why G77 in China was united behind this demand, and we heard similar things at this session. So I would like to invite Ambassador Nabil to share his reflections.
Thank you so much, Harjeet, and thank you to everyone. Thank you for organizing this event and for this very moving documentary, although I just saw the last part of it, but in fact heard the last part of it because I couldn't see it. But it was moving, and it really struck a chord that this is not something that is just that the G77 or all of us are negotiating about. It is real impact. And if you don't acknowledge the problem, then you're not going to take it forward. So the first step has always to be the acknowledgement. I think what you said about G77 in Glasgow, we got this, but of course you all know that after the adoption of the final document, G77 made a very strong statement saying that we were extremely disappointed at the Glasgow Dialogue paragraph, because that is not what we wanted. We wanted to go way beyond that. And that was, but we just took it because it was a compromise, and we thought it was kind of like a foot in the door, at least something to start discussions and to move forward. But that is way less than what we actually wanted. We don't, I know the science is very unambiguous in this, and I would just like to quote the Secretary General of the United Nations. When the last IPCC report came, he said that it was a damning indictment of failed global leadership on climate. And that is so true. And we are the leadership on climate, unfortunately. And if we are not able to deliver what the world wants from us, then how do things move forward? And it is the G77 that has been raising this issue of loss and damage finance for a long time. Some of our members have been doing it for more than 25 years. And now finally, as you were saying, at least people are understanding what it is. You don't have to at least explain what it is now anymore. And Glasgow and Bonn, the G77 both have been, at both places we've been united. And our ask has been establishment of a finance facility. What we have is, of course, I won't even comment on that, because that's a tangible outcome. Discussions is not a tangible outcome. The Glasgow Dialogue is, as it stands now, a one-off dialogue is, and please excuse I won't use French, but it's just a talk shop. It's nothing more than that. We'll just come, we will talk, we will go, and that will be the end of it. It doesn't have a process, it doesn't lead to anything, it doesn't even have a report. So what are we talking about? We can all have our discussions on our own, and we all know what we are going to say, but it has to lead to something. And it is discussions. So far, what we have seen in Glasgow Dialogue is a lot of it is focused on insurance. Slow onset events. Would insurance cover that? How? What would be the definition? So the real actors have to move in. Without that, it is just not possible. And then again, if we look at the Paris Agreement, Article 8, it talks about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. We've been talking about averting and minimizing. That's mitigation and adaptation. Addressing is nowhere there. So, and then they talk about balance. How do you? Even in these three words, there's no balance. And how would you have balance in the final outcome documents? So we're still having, of course, discussions, SBI chair is holding consultations. We are still hoping that something will move, because that's something, of course, I mean, we are not naive. We've been doing it for a long time as well. We are not thinking of establishing a finance facility in COP27 or in SB 56. That is not going to happen. But at least a movement forward, that is what we need. A process, something that can lead to things. And that's, we still are very hopeful. We've had a couple of bilateral discussions with the SBI chair as well. One I had about 3 hours ago as well. And hopefully she's going to propose something this evening. And fingers crossed, we may have something good to report by tomorrow morning. But still, fingers crossed, I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nabil, for being very candid and sharing what's going on and the struggle developing countries have had to really push this issue despite such a grim reality on ground. And you talked about avert, minimize, and address, and Salim was there. He made a very strong pitch saying we should actually drop avert and minimize. So for all of you to know, avert means averting the crisis, which means actually mitigation. And when we talk about minimizing, it's about adaptation. It's not about the impacts that we are already seeing. Address is what it is, and that's what Salim said. That let's just drop it because it's causing confusion, we are wasting time. That's for some other place. We already have mitigation and adaptation streams. Why are we discussing it? And prior to that, there was a lot of confusion also being created deliberately that loss and damage is nothing but adaptation. And that's why this video, last year, it was made just to tell it's different. When impacts are there, you can't talk about adaptation. And I heard a very disturbing statement from a party I should not name. They said, oh yeah, now we have started facing disasters. So we have realized that it's not adaptation. So I was like, and it's a developed country party. Said you were waiting for that to happen in your backyard. Then you realized we have been saying it for the last 20 years. We are losing homes and income and farms. So yeah, I mean, it's very, very disturbing. And we really hope that the kind of, but we must appreciate that this Glasgow dialogue was very different from SUVA expert dialogue. You are right, Ambassador Nabil, there was still a lot more focus on insurance, but we also heard some real real stories from ground, what's happening, how people are losing their lands forever, non-economic losses and damages. That was quite a bit focus, quite a lot of focus on that. Also slow onset events, which we don't hear about, but you rightly said insurance doesn't work. I'll come to you later also on the way forward, but let's open the floor and get you all involved. So if you have your laptop or a phone, take it out, and we'll have a quick reflection from you. Because when we say loss and damage finance facility, everybody is asking this question, why do you need a facility? So we would like to hear from you, what do you think the role that facility should play, given a massive gap in the architecture? So the code is, so go to menti.com, and the code is 67255141. So punch that code, and then you will have this question, and you can type your answer. So what does the role of a loss and damage finance facility mean to you? What role do you think it should play? You have 30 more seconds to share your response. Okay, while you are still sending the response, I'm really impressed to see how climate justice, without we saying anything, has featured, so prominently. And we can also see how you are relating it with reparations and compensation, justice, accountability, and the right thing to do. And everything else around it, also important. I can see needs-based support. I can see transparency. I can see accountability, global justice, ownership, capacity, finance. Everything else supports the core of what we are demanding. It's about climate justice. It's about reparation. It's about compensation. Even in the video you saw, there's a strong call for compensation. But when we come to this UNFCCC space, it's very clear that that language is not going to land. And as developing countries, as civil society dropped that word in 2012, when we were in Doha, with the spirit that there is going to be more cooperation from the developed countries. Till that point, even AOSIS had a multi-window proposal, which had compensation very much enshrined in that proposal to UNFCCC. But it was dropped with the spirit of international cooperation and solidarity, and the language that was adopted in 2012 in the anticipation of Warsaw International Mechanism, that we will go for the agreed language of means of implementation, which is finance, technological support, and capacity building. So the spirit of compensation and reparation remains. But we know in this space we will not be using the language, and we will expect developed countries to fulfill their responsibilities and provide adequate finance. But unfortunately, that did not happen. We have lost 10 precious years. So imagine the first agreement, as you are saying, if we agree for a facility, similar thing happened in 2012 when we decided to set up Warsaw International Mechanism with a very clear function on action and support. But nothing happened in the last 10 years. We expected, and what some of our developed country parties don't realize, that whatever we do today, we write history. If you look at how the institutions were created, those expert groups, we had to again fight for an expert group on action and support in 2019. Which was the first one that was formed in 2014 itself? Insurance. And then it was slow onset events and non-economic losses. But for action and support, which is very much the third function of Warsaw International Mechanism, and one of the 5 work streams of the executive committee's 5-year plan, it never saw the light of the day until we had fought for it in 2019. So it clearly shows the intention to engage and contribute, despite we dropping the word on compensation and reparations, which very much speak to the core of climate justice, when we talk about. So yeah, and again, we are hearing a lot more on insurance. Coming back to the facility, and as you have said, there are many elements that we have talked about. I would like to turn to you, Liane, to share, because we came here with this document, knowing that negotiations are moving very, very slow. So we as civil society came with a proposal, which was formulated by Climate Action Network, ActionAid, Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Practical Action, and Stamp Out Poverty, to say that if you don't want to start discussing about the facility because you think elements are not there, this is the base proposal. So you discuss that. So we are going to share something from this. Liane, over to you. Share some of the functions that you think the facility should be playing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harjeet. And I have to say, I'm likewise very impressed with the conclusions of the Mentimeter, as it puts climate justice so clearly in the center, where it should be. And actually, the facility that we have in mind has to be focused on a climate justice approach and a human rights-based approach, has to be gender responsive, has to take the needs of the communities that are mostly affected into account. So should be based on a couple of principles. And obviously the international cooperation, solidarity, the historical responsibility, and the polluter pays principle. What we can say here within the space is at the center of that. But also that the finance that is provided through a facility should be new and additional. It should not be cannibalizing way too little adaptation funds that we have right now. It needs to be needs-based, and we are just starting to actually get a good understanding of the scale of the needs. It needs to be adequate. That means it needs to be grant-based. We really can't afford for countries that are already bearing the brunt of so much of the climate impacts to further be indebted for a crisis that they haven't contributed to, and particularly for communities that are already putting up their own resources. It has to be dealing and receiving predictable finance and precautionary, meaning it needs to be able to be scalable, can be scaled up, so that it can actually receive a variety of inputs. Now, to some of the key functions, it should be exclusively focused on addressing loss and damage. And that's because we heard that too long the discourse on loss and damage was diverted with the focus on the minimizing and aversion. This one really has to just focus on addressing loss and damage. It has to be both a coordinating and a financing mechanism. And I think having both functions is very, very important. So some of the key functions that we would like to see included is the tracking, accounting for, and providing oversight over what funding is actually there for addressing loss and damage. And that should be both from within existing funds under the financial mechanism, but also take into account what is happening outside. It should identify the needs-based funding gaps of developing countries. It should help in catalyzing and coordinating the financial support, including through the relevant bodies like the WIM, EXCOM, and existing funds, the operating entities under the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Obviously, the main thing is establishing and managing the fund to fill the funding gaps. It has to be focused on scale, as I mentioned. It has to be focused on the areas covered, not covered by existing institutions. It also should play a role in mobilizing and dispersing financial resources to developing countries. It should facilitate and look into the use of new financial instruments and financing approaches. And again, that comes last, but for me, this is a core. Loss and damage is not something abstract. It's how it's impacting people. People are suffering. We need to really focus on what really puts money into the hands of people that are severely affected. And that means that the loss and damage finance facility really needs to make sure that finance addresses the needs and priorities of and can reach the most vulnerable and marginalized community through monitoring, accountability, and evaluation processes that take particularly local ownership and a participation of local community in decision-making into account.
Thank you so much, Liane. I think that sounds pretty clear, but I'm sure we are not claiming that we have covered all the ground. So I would like to open the floor to get you all involved. What you heard in terms of the gaps that we already see, it's a missing piece in the architecture. There is no oversight. There are numerous examples over the last few years where the support to countries has not been adequate. And it's about coordination. Nobody's saying that you kill the existing streams as humanitarian or other kinds of support going in the name of solidarity. It's all welcome. But how we are completely missing a system that, as Liane said, that has an oversight, that coordinates and also generates resources. So let's take a pause. Let's hear from you. What do you think are we missing? You already shared a few ideas on what it should be doing. You said new and additional. Liane also talked about that, in terms of principles. So I'm sure some of the things that you shared through Menti are captured. Tell us what is missing in terms of functions or principles. Please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
I can do it without it.
No, I think it's being recorded.
Thank you. I'm Niels Mollema from ActionAid. Unfortunately, Teresa was out sick. What strikes me when I read this is that I'm missing something on explicitly accessibility. I understand why we have locally driven, but I do think it's worthwhile to add a key factor of just accessibility, because this has been a thing that's been, even the ones that are well-designed, even the funds that are well-designed with the needs of these communities, there's been a lack of framework and acknowledgement that these communities then can't reach it. So I'd like that explicit.
Thank you, Nils, my buddy from past life. I was with ActionAid. Salim.
Thank you very much. I'm Salim ul Haq. I'm the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. One of the things I'm hearing a lot in the corridors here is about perhaps giving a mandate to existing institutions like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. I just want to second what we just heard about. One of the criteria for loss and damage, which makes it very, very different from anything else we've had in climate finance, is it has to come fast. You know, we had a heat wave in Pakistan. People are dying in Pakistan. They need the money tomorrow. We don't have time to write a proposal, have 3 years of processing in the Green Climate Fund. So I would say the Green Climate Fund is an absolute non-starter. It is designed to be delayed in getting money to where it's needed, okay, by design. And so by no means can you agree to have a mandate given to the Green Climate Fund to do loss and damage, because they will not be able to deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. We can take one or two more. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Natalia. I am from a human rights based in Colombia called De Justicia. And I think that following the point of the two previous people who talked, I think that accessibility, the time frame in which there is a response is key. There should also be a redress mechanism to make sure that the funds are channeled in the most following human rights considerations. And also I would like to add that being the funds community-led and community ownership is key. And I have a key example from Colombia. We recently had it has been 2 years, but it seems like not 2 years since the reconstruction efforts have been very, very precarious. We had Hurricane Iota, which destroyed more than 90% of the island of Providence in Colombia. And it was the opportunity for the government to, in reconstruction efforts, to started plans to build a military base in ethnic communities, despite the fact that in 2015 they had to say in prior consultation that they did not want the military base, and when seeing the plans of the military base, it looked more like a vacational complex for the military. And the community is just so tired that when we were doing litigation efforts with them, they were just like, we don't even care about reconstruction at this point. It has been 2 years. And we are tired of seeing armed people all around the island being threatened because of us saying that, hey, we don't want once again that military complex here. We don't want to ask once again for consultation. We are tired of tourism companies trying to buy our land for very little money. So having this community-led, and they were just like, also they were saying, we are tired that the government doesn't listen to us, and they are ignoring completely our cultural view of how these islands should be reconstructed. So definitely the funds being community-led, but having a redress mechanism just to make sure that human rights are followed through every single stage is key. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing all the details. We can take one more or two more, and then we would like to have reflection.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Anne from the Women and Gender constituency. And I think among the principles that you have mentioned, gender responsiveness is certainly one that should be there. We know that natural disasters and climate-induced natural disasters result in gender-based violence, in forced marriage, in loss of education opportunities, or actually deschooling for girls. And we know that women tend to be more, affected by natural catastrophes because they are not informed properly, etc., and they cannot cope. So I think that really this facility should have as a core principle the gender responsiveness. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And you are speaking to a great gender rights advocate here. So yeah. Anna, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Annabella, Greenpeace International. And I thank you for the presentation and for being very concrete on what our expectations could be on the facility. More than a suggestion on principles, I had a question in particular for the negotiators, because in the intro video that we watched, there was, we were pointing out to two kinds of responsibilities. One is the historical responsibilities from developed countries, and the other one is the responsibility of fossil fuel companies, which ultimately made all the benefits out of this climate wreckage. And I wonder, from a negotiator's perspective, from a party's perspective, in particular the most impacted ones, how you are seeing potentially the responsibility of those fossil fuel majors in bonding the facility. I see what Liane was reading, like the facility should be able to capture funds, but we know that that is not going to come voluntarily. So those companies need to be made to pay, as polluter pays principle. And are you seeing like governments being asked to impose a tax or some form of national mechanism to make them pay? Are you thinking, for example, about the UN forcing fossil fuel majors to pay for something? And more generally, what's your sense of what civil society can mobilize around, on top of asking for historical responsibilities from developed countries? Your take on this other part of the equation would be really useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, if I was to respond to all the questions in one word, I would say yes to all of them. But I think I am expected to dilate a little bit more on this. So I think, first of all, let me start with what Salim Saab said. If you look at Pakistan, in the last about 2 decades, 90% of our natural disasters are climate-induced. We've had floods, we've had droughts, we've had, we don't have hurricanes, but something similar. And the losses have been in billions of dollars, thousands of lives lost. Just one flood, I'll quote you, in 2010. And this flood, and Pakistan is not a small country. We are about 750,000 square kilometers. We have a population of 220 million. And a big percentage of that 750,000 kilometers was underwater. It's unimaginable if you look at from a developed country's perspective that this can also happen. But it did happen. So I fully agree that the scale of the catastrophe is not even realized in the developed world, because they are not, and as we were saying, they're probably now facing these kind of things. One point additional that I want to make before I go into the questions is that one of the words that I saw here was compassion. And I think from what I see in the room today, a vast majority of the people here are females. And I think it's because of compassion. For some reason, I think, unfortunately, we don't have that much. So it's good to see, because it is you who are going to make the change happen. Because you are the ones who are going to drive it. I mean, again, I'm not a great advocate of males, because what happens is that we are not that compassionate, and we are not really willing to drive things as females are. And so it's very important that this should continue. Coming specifically to your questions, accessibility, absolutely. The funds that we have, you talked about GCF, and it's many of such funds. I think their main purpose, it's kind of built in that they slow things down. And then they don't have predictable finances. So they can't even plan long term. And the money that is required by developing countries is today. In fact, yesterday. So if we are going to take like 5 years in accessing a fund, and then they have limitations on the amount of money that is to be disbursed, like say some have $1 million. $1 million for a country like Pakistan is peanuts. What will that do for a 220 million people country? So, so accessibility is extremely important, because rules and procedures have to be simplified, and they have to be also expedited. So simplification as well as making them faster. Without that, it's not going to happen. On the mechanism and the country ownership and the community ownership, I fully agree. You know, if many of the solutions do come through the communities, because they are the ones who are on ground, they are able to understand things better. And so community-driven, absolutely, they have to be community-driven. Gender perspective, I already spoke about the compassion. I think gender perspective is extremely important. And I think there was one more thing about the fossil fuel companies. What was it? Anna, yeah, you mentioned that. So it's, I think it will have to be a mixture of different things. I don't know whether the UN would be able to do too much, because the UN, the only coercive power in the UN is through the Security Council and through the sanctions regime. I don't think that's going to work here. I think we need, more of persuasiveness, but also kind of dabbed with a little bit of sanctioning. And sanctioning not in the UN sense, sanctioning in the sense of having laws to make sure that the polluter, as you said, paid. Because without that, it's not going to happen. We will make all the persuasions, but still people who have to actually got to pay. It's not easy. If you ask me to give €1 today, I'm going to ask 10 questions. Why? So you're asking these companies to fork out billions of dollars, so it's not going to be easy. But I think it has to be a mixture of many things. We don't have one specific answer for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for coming in, although Ambassador Nabil answered it already comprehensively. So let me maybe add a couple of notes from a tech geek, finance geek perspective. Although I wanted to start out in saying, Ambassador Nabil, I really appreciate the sentiment of seeing some parts of the gender spectrum being more compassionate as the other one, but I would just say, let's not let men off the hook. They should definitely, as part of the both societal transformation and systemic transformation that we all need, be part of the solution, or not a continued part of the patriarchal problem. So I'm just saying that in the outset. Thank you. Let me get to some of the technical aspects on the question of accessibility. And actually, Salim's question, Neil's question, Natalia's question, and An's question from various points all went around the issue of accessibility. And I think that's the core issue, because we know that the current funds do not work in that respect. They also lack significantly in gender responsiveness. I want to point that out too, despite having formal provisions for most of the funds now, like a gender policy or gender action plans even. But the proof in the pudding is really the access to finance, who gets it and under what conditions. And there we see lacking in access for local communities, in gender responsive access for local communities, and in a form and a fashion that is usable by local communities. So the funds that are currently working are assuming a trickle-down expectation. So, you have an international access entity, and they will eventually share some funding or will prioritize that. That doesn't work. Trickle-down hasn't worked in the economic policy framework either. That's just as a little side note. So one of the things that the loss and damage finance facility that we envision really prioritizes is not only direct access, which would mean that national or subnational bodies, entities can actually get money directly from the facility, but something that the geeks would call enhanced direct access, which means that funding decisions are really taken at the most local level possible. That's the subsidiarity principle that we would like to see enforced. And that would mean, for example, that a country might receive a larger financing sum through structures that they have at the national level, where then a coordinating body with the participation of local community representatives makes individual funding decision and in shapes and forms as grants, as smaller grants, for example, that are accessible to communities. And there are some existing better practice examples, like the JEF Small Grants Program has such nationally set up coordinating mechanisms. There is the possibility to get to smaller grants for actually having locally determined, locally chaired, and locally contributed solution. And this is definitely something that we would look for as the core access modality for loss and damage finance facilities. And then that also delves into the question of, you know, what kind of, and that goes to the issue of rapid response that Salim pointed out, that the GCF as a fund really is not capable for that rapid response. A loss and damage finance facility, again, as we envision it, would at least start out with 2 funding windows, one that has an urgent response, where you wouldn't have to have, you know, accredited entity or a funding proposal, but certain triggers, like, for example, almost like parametric triggers, for example, a certain number of people are affected, or a certain GDP of your country is affected, and then you get fast disbursement of a sum, again, to be distributed then within the country and not at the fund level. And I think this goes very much to actually, and I think this what makes the loss and damage finance facility proposal and discourse so interesting. Not only are we addressing a financing gap and a moral gap that has existed for way too long, but we can also do it in a way that showcases all those better practices that the current global climate finance architecture, including the funds under the UNFCCC, do not take into account. So I think it's a great opportunity, and we should push. That also means, by the way, movement by countries. I have to say that, because a lot of countries in the discourse are very happy at talking about developing countries receiving finance, but are a little bit more reluctant when it comes then devolving, sharing the finance with subnational level, with local communities or local governments. And this is actually where we need to push developing country governments as well.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nabil and Liane, for that comprehensive response. Sindra was resistant to speak, but I'm like, please do. She is our key author for the paper that we developed along with Liane, myself, and Heidi. And so, yeah, Sindra, why don't, she's from CAN International as Senior Program Officer. Why don't you share some of the examples of rapid mobilization, as there was a question from Annabella, and also some of the other sources that we have mentioned in the paper?
Thank you, Harjeet. Yes, I was reluctant to speak, but this is such an important issue that I think I should. So throughout history, we've seen that it's possible to rapidly mobilize funds. And I think for many of us, it seems kind of baffling that for something that is causing so much suffering that we're unable to move the finance needed. And recent examples include the pandemic and also now the war in Ukraine. We see rapid mobilization of funds, but always it seems like it is in the form of self-interest underlyingly, and often it enhances inequality as well, or deepens inequality. And we also see that already that there are sources of finance available, be this in the form of special drawing rights or debt restructuring or cancellation. And there's different tax structures and modalities we can use. So from climate damages taxes to a financial transaction tax, and also addressing the big problem of subsidies as well. So, yeah, to fossil fuels. So we have all of these tools already there, and they're ready to use and mobilize. But we have to now question what the actual underlying issue is, and that seems like it's a lack of political will and something a little bit deeper as well.
Thank you, Sindra. And when she talked about climate damages tax, it's a levy on fossil fuel industry extraction. We know, it has to be phased out completely, but till the time they survive, we have to make sure that they are taxed handsomely. Okay, so thank you very much for your contributions on principles and functions. We are now going to talk about where this facility should be located. We have some idea to present, and some of the operational modalities that we think this facility should have. So Liane, back to you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. So maybe just a couple of points, I guess, on some of the operational modalities still. And I'm kind of procrastinating a little bit because the question of where it's situated is actually a very tough one, and I'm not quite sure that we necessarily conclusively have come to the final answer, because there is a lot to be under consideration. So I just wanted to go really quickly on some of the operational modality. Eligibility, I think this is very important. All developing countries, parties to the Convention and the Paris Agreement, should be eligible to receive funding, and very important, that should not be tied in any way or shape to them either providing an input or the scale of the input that they might voluntarily make. But again, it's just very clear that we are saying the core financial input has to come from public financing provided in grant form by developed country. If you call it compensation, if you call it a reparation, if you call it historical responsibility, if you call it lift, polluter pays principle, it really doesn't matter, but that's where the money should come from. On the decision-making body composition and functions, I think it is very important that it will be governed by a decision-making body that should not just have equal representation between developed and developing countries, and I think we need to go further than countries, but equitable representation. We have some examples. The Adaptation Fund, for example, has equitable representation, which means actually that the majority of those represented in their Adaptation Fund Board Secretariat are from developing countries. Where we would like to go even further, and obviously there need to be dedicated seats for SITs and LDCs. Where we would like to go even further is saying that we need to have community representation on the board as well, and as part of the decision making. And again, there are best practice examples in the wider universe of funds. The Global Fund, for example, for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, has some representation of affected communities on their board. And I think this is a precedent whose time really has come in the UNFCCC climate financing world and universe. And then lastly, it will need a secretariat just because there is a lot of administrative, financial, and technical expertise that need to be bundled to have both the financing and the coordination function. So I think those are really, really crucial. Now coming to the question where it should be located, and I'm sorry, Sindra, that I'm jumping quite a bit around, and now I'm trying to find my own notes on that. So it obviously is very important that this is part of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and ideally we would like to see it as the third operating entity under the financial mechanism. The currently existing 2 operating entities are the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. But it's also clear that it cannot just sit there by itself. It needs to be collected. It needs to be accountable, not just to the COP and the CMA, but also interact and be responsive and listen to the guidance that comes from the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism. And so we see it currently as the financial arm of the Warsaw International Mechanism. Now, there have been quite a number of discourses of, should that be under some existing operating entity. Salim has pointed out it would be really hard to bring it under the GCF. People have talked about it possibly being a window, and for a number of reasons that wouldn't work, including that many of the operational modalities of the Green Climate Fund are really not in line with the climate justice approach, unfortunately. But there are other considerations. You could, for example, think of whether some possibility would be to have it as a special trust fund situated, or as its own separate fund, and that is basically, obviously, that option that would allow to really construct it and have it developed and design again through a participatory, engaging with equitable representation process in a way that is in line with the principles that we have laid out, but also basically serving the needs of developing countries and communities.
Thank you, Liane, and also thank you for underlining that point. Of course, we have come here with a proposal, and we have spoken to experts. So we got this advice that if we situate it under the Warsaw International Mechanism, it can still be very much part of the financial mechanism as the third arm, because that's the missing piece in the architecture. And working with WIM and EXCOM is extremely important alongside Santiago Network, because we are talking about a body that should be informed by the needs on ground, and this is where the Santiago Network plays a role in terms of doing the technical level assessments and what are the gaps, and then the loss and damage finance facility can then provide funds to the Santiago Network and also to the countries to respond to disasters. And we also discussed that it's not that everything has to be covered by the finance facility. If you see the report, on page 21, we've also highlighted, while Salim and everybody else knows that GCF, it has been very difficult, but there are issues like permanent relocation, which we know in some cases is going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years. And we know that GCF takes about 2 to 4 years to approve and get the project going, but those things can be undertaken, but of course with more money as a top-up to Green Climate Fund. Similarly, Jeff has expertise in the area of biodiversity protection and conservation, and also issues of desertification. So which we should actually leverage the expertise different institutions have, not to think that LDFF is going to be one massive fund to root every single penny that needs to go to respond to disaster. So we have been looking at a very pragmatic approach, as you have been hearing the issues around access and speed. So that's extremely important. Again, we'll take a pause and hear from you on how do you think the proposed structure that we have put forward and some of the operational modalities that Liane talked about. So feel free to ask questions or share your reflections.
Hi, Harjeet. It's Amali Tower from Climate Refugees. I just had a thought. Given that displacement is already one of the biggest impacts, and you've got WIM up there, I'm mindful of the Central Emergency Response Fund and everything that came out of post-tsunami, and how OCHA and the humanitarian community came together for rapid response, rapid deployment, rapid, gathering of funds, and whether there are best practices there to look at, given that there's so many parallels here in terms of displacement, and you're going to have a lot of the same actors responding. I'm thinking of what the ambassador said, I mean, I responded to the 2010 floods in Pakistan, and, you know, we had funds quickly, you know, because of surf. So, yeah, just a thought. And as for reparations, I've always thought, is it helpful to think about things in terms of negotiations as framing this as development setbacks for developed countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Amali. Any other question or reflection? Any other question? Niti, go ahead.
I have two very simple questions. One may be related to the previous session, directed to Ambassador. I was one of those who wrote compassion in the Mentimeter. I was also the one standing next to you at the reception, asking you what were the chances of getting loss and damage finance facility onto the agenda at SB 56. So maybe I'll repeat that question to you and how you see it meandering through the system and getting onto the agenda on the inside, as an insider perspective, and what we can do from the outside to help, you know, prioritize the issue for you, to help you with your work on the inside. My second question is to the others on the panel. Say COP27 happens and LDFF is accepted. How soon do you see money flowing in and being dispersed to affected communities? Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm Niti from Climate Action Network Southeast Asia from Malaysia.
Any other question? Please go ahead. Colin.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Introduce yourself.
Colin McQuiston from Practical Action, and also involved in the report. Just a question on this nexus between being under the institutional body of the WIM and the financial mechanism. If it was set up as it is on that diagram, does it need an accountability mechanism under the finance mechanism? Does it also need a separate accountability mechanism under the WIM? Could it have one, or should they be split? Thank you.
Okay, Liane, do you want to start?
Okay. So I have to start with a confession that I'm not an expert on the humanitarian setup of funding, and that is obviously a very important actor. However, as we have pointed out, we want the loss and damage finance facility to play a coordinating role. And what we certainly don't want is a focus on the humanitarian funding that we know is not enough either. And Oxfam has just come out with a great report that points out that, you know, the humanitarian funding, which is, by the way, obviously always voluntary, no predictability, and even in terms of accessibility, it's not what we, for example, need for some of the slower onset activities, or even past the immediate response to you know, a climate-related catastrophe, where we do need iterative funding, meaning not just coming in with one funding amount and then half a year later being gone, but actually repeated funding. So again, while all of that architecture certainly plays a role, and again, we are not talking about displacing funding, we are talking about new and additional funding, so the additionality aspect of funding provided through the loss and damage finance facility is a core issue. The coordinating part, the bits and pieces, what actor is doing what, where are the gaps? We said one of the function is particularly looking at the gaps of what is with current actors not funded. That is a core function of the loss and damage finance facility. On the question of, yes, jubilation at COP27, parties agree to set up a loss and damage finance facility. How soon can money flow? I would say it depends. However, because we had the experience of previous funding setups, like, for example, the Green Climate Fund, which was not such a quick setup, there are obviously lessons learned on how you can speed up. You would obviously need some sort of a, and the Green Climate Fund had something called the Transitional Committee, which was kind of a design phase where you basically spend some time designing, and again, that design should be like the Transitional Committee with equitable representation, but bringing in communities, so have more developing countries. You could do that in a couple of months if you focused at the Green, for the Transitional Committee. You had 4 meetings that actually came out with something like the constitution for the Green Climate Fund. Something like that could similarly happen for a loss and damage finance facility once that mandate is given by the COP. And then within a year, I think you could start, based on that basic mandate, start the fundraising and do the what's it called, start with some of the operationalizing, getting some of the core policies done within a year or 2 years. And so when we originally looked at it, and to avoid that the Glasgow Dialogue really is just a talk shop, we actually looked how you could fit a plan towards operationalization with funding within the 3-year time frame of the Glasgow Dialogue. But that would mean that we probably should do a little bit more than we currently are doing here in the Bonn session in order to stick to the timetable. And I would give that back to Harjeet because I think he has worked quite significantly on that time frame and looking at what is possible in that time frame.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll speak to that. And Niti, I would suggest we take your question later because that was going to be, you stole my question, by the way. So that's exactly we would like to hear from Ambassador Nabil. So you're absolutely right. We would like to hear, but let's first respond to that question. Ambassador Nabil, would you like to respond to some of the questions related to where it should be located and operationalization first?
With SURF, and I think I agree. There are a lot of things that can be learned from there. The UN system itself is very good in responding to catastrophes. The only difference is that they always respond to catastrophes that are urgent. And we have to start realizing that this is also an urgent catastrophe. So I think if we are able to make that connection, the UN, and we don't need to, as Liane was saying, we don't have to create everything from scratch. We have to use the things that we have. And nobody is saying that we need a huge architecture from scratch which will do everything. We have to use what we have and make an architecture that is able to utilize all of that, the SURF, the UN system, and the funds that we have. I mean, some of the things, the good things that you have in the funds, they can also be used in this as well. So you don't want me to take Niti's question for now?
Yeah, we'll come to that.
Okay. Okay. So I think on the architecture, I would tend to leave it to the experts. We are negotiators. We are more like generalists, and these are very technical issues. So I would rather that we have the main principles agreed, and then the rest. We have a lot of experts who can deal with that. Thank you.
Absolutely, Ambassador Nabil. Sorry. Okay. So Colin, your question, we actually checked with experts, and we can have a body which can be under WIM, in this case LDFF, which can be accountable to WIM and then to the COP, and also through the financial mechanism and eventually to the COP. So that's absolutely possible technically. We did check before putting forward that suggestion. And in terms of how soon the money should reach communities, that's exactly what we have been concerned about, because people are already suffering. We are not talking about a situation where we can wait for years. And that's how, as Liane said, we have a proposal where we are saying year 1 should be, which means this year, it should be about agreeing on the functions, broad functions, and broad operational modalities where it should be not really getting into a lot of details, and how we can start a process of looking at the finance gaps. If those three things are done this year, I think we are good enough, we can establish the facility. And year two can be a lot more about then the operationalization part, defining the governing arrangements, and also looking at a process that can start for a speedy and ambitious and needs-based resource mobilization. Third year should be full operationalization, and money should start flowing to developing countries. So that's what. So it's a 3-year Glasgow dialogue. We can't just have an endless dialogue, as Ambassador Nabil said in the beginning. We have to make sure that there are clear milestones, which we have articulated also in this paper, and we also came up with a briefing paper earlier. So there is a plan that we are proposing, and that's what we have to do. And when we talk to negotiators, we are told that they are saying that even the Glasgow dialogue should become more muscular. It should be more processes need to be added, which we also heard from the Pakistani delegation on behalf of G77, that there should be more submissions, there should be more dialogues, more discussions. So there are ways of doing it exactly what we are proposing. We can have 1 or 2 more questions on this, and then we will talk about the next steps. Any other questions or reflections on the functions or operational modalities or where it's situated before we go to what next then? Sure. Please.
On where it is to be situated, I think there was, you spoke about the concept and the fact that it needs to be, it needs to bring in a number of factors for it to be actually situated somewhere. Have you also thought about physical situation? Where would it be physically situated? You think UNFCCC Secretariat, for example, one of the places where it could bring all, because for being situated somewhere physically as well, it has to have a lot of paraphernalia around it that should help it out. Just food for thought.
That's a very good question, and honestly, we did not think of that. But what we did think of, it should be under UNFCCC, and as Climate Action Network, we also made an intervention during the Glasgow Dialogue. And I will be very candid here. I come from the humanitarian community, and I understand the disaster risk reduction sector. I was in Bali for the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we do see the role of humanitarian community. But let's also recognize, and we should use all these funding streams and implementation streams, as Amali was talking about, but let's recognize we are talking about something really, really massive. Before we went to Sendai for the disaster risk reduction new framework, Sendai framework, which we got it, United Nations published a report in March 2015 saying 90% of disasters are climate related. That was the situation then. It was more about extreme weather events. It did not talk about slow onset events. And that's the UN report. You can find it on internet. 7 years down the line, we have IPCC reports telling us the absolutely grim situation. And we also heard in the room during Glasgow Dialogue that non-economic losses, slow onset events, we don't have a system to deal with that. So absolutely humanitarian community has a role to play, but let's not do it in a fragmented manner, but do it. And yeah, so where it should be physically located? Should be here, should be Geneva, or should be some developing countries, because bulk of the disasters are happening in developing countries and they need more support. But it's a good question that we should be trying to answer. Okay, welcome Tasneem. Tasneem Issop is our Executive Director of Climate Action Network. She was in a meeting with Patricia, so that's how she's joining us now. So just to give you a snapshot, we have Ambassador Nabil from Pakistan, who's the G77 and China chair. So we talked about what happened at the Glasgow Dialogue. We really got into the proposal that we came here with and got some great reflections from the participants. And Neeti stole my question. I'm complaining. So Neeti said that, so what now? We have heard the urgency. We have heard that we need to be bridging the gap. Of course, developing countries are demanding the facility, not developed countries so enthusiastically. And Ambassador Nabil did talk about the ongoing discussions, but yeah, now Neeti's question get activated. Please do share what next, what do we achieve here at this session? How do we make sure that there's a substantive discussion and what you were saying in terms of having a roadmap for the facility? Please. Yes, please. Oh, yeah.
I thought the thing was that.
No.
So thank you. No, I think I would like to think that I'm an optimist. So as Niti said, COP27, something established, still a possibility. But if you want me to be very candid and frank, it's a very limited possibility. And we are, I think, really running out of time. We've almost, I mean, if you look at the actual negotiations part and the decisions that we have to take, we are almost at the end of Bonn. Because it's like, Monday evening, we have to present the decisions by Wednesday morning. So it's like 36 hours to go. So it's still a possibility. We're still fighting for it. But it's very, very limited scope for that happening. But as I said in the beginning, I think what is important is that we at least have a process that is leading somewhere. Even if the Glasgow Dialogue is, as a process, starts moving towards, because right now, as many of you might have heard, that some of our partners are allergic even to talk about a financing facility. They don't want those words anywhere. So if we have a discussion in which, even if it's an open-ended discussion, we are talking about different possibilities, and financing facility is one of them, we have a very good case. So in the end, it should lead to that. So in that sense, if we have a broader discussion that starts talking about, and that's what we are trying to establish, that we have a discussion that starts talking about loss and damage, that starts talking about how to tackle with it, and that starts talking about the addressing part of loss and damage, then we would be able to move into a direction that would eventually lead to it. But again, I think slow and step-by-step approach is probably where what's going to lead us to that. But your second part of the question was, how can you help? How can the civil society help? I think just that pressure that you're creating, that is extremely, extremely important. I mean, there are our partners, delegations coming to me and saying, well, what happened? The civil society used to be on our side. What happened? Well, you have to realize this is an important issue on which everybody in the civil society understands that you are on the wrong side. And so once that realization comes, then of course civil society is going to be to strengthen our hands. Reports like these, we have put all the facts on the paper, and it's for not only our own negotiators, they are of course going to use it, but the other side is also going to see that these are facts and figures. You've not made it up, or have you? There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know, Tasneem, you came running, but I think you got a gist of it. You could hear the role civil society has played, and thank you very much, Ambassador Nabil, for recognizing and coming from you as G77 and China chair, and you know the kind of struggle we have had over the last few years to put it on the agenda. Tasneem, I would like to invite you to share how the journey has been, and how we take it forward. Also responding to even Niti's question on what we do as a network and our allies.
Thank you very much, Harjeet, and greetings to everybody on the panel. And Ambassador, thank you very much for your participation. And apologies for being late. It's been one of those days. So, firstly, I mean, I just want to be very clear that we, as civil society, we will remain optimistic all the time. But not just a kind of fluffy optimism. We back that up with serious determination, because we recognize that our role is to ensure that those who are at the front lines of this climate crisis, that their needs, their priorities are addressed here. And right now, we know that millions are suffering across the world. So I'm sure you've had many of those discussions. And so it's our responsibility to act with determination to get real progress and real outcomes for them. Now, when we realized when we were going up to COP26 that, once again, loss and damage, beside the Santiago network, loss and damage finance was not on the agenda, we decided as a network, look, of course, all the other issues are important, But it's time for us to unite, not just in our network as CAN, but in the wider movement of civil society, allies across the board, and make this an agenda. In other words, we'll force this to be an agenda at Glasgow. It must become an issue that could not be ignored. And we sort of set a very ambitious objective, we thought, and then we were really amazed at the groundswell of support that we received behind this push and escalation on loss and damage finance and the finance facility, to the point that, you know, it was headline news across the world, the philanthropies came in, Nicola Sturgeon came in, and there was a massive groundswell beyond the UNFCCC process itself. And as we entered into this year, that momentum is maintained, and we certainly maintain that momentum. And coming into Bonn, it was very clear that this will remain our priority. The movement stood united, and I'm happy to hear that our actions have sort of left some kind of mark, maybe not strong enough, but we will not stop. So the actions here were pretty directed towards telling governments that the time for talking is over, actually. You know, yes, of course we must talk about our different ideas for what this facility could look like, but you can never have never-ending conversations here. And we know this process. It's always these long, long, long dialogues, and it takes too long to land decisions. But the climate crisis cannot wait. People cannot wait. They're suffering already. And there's no help beyond humanitarian, but there's no help for the real losses and damages we're experiencing. So we're going to keep at it. We believe that, and we've made the call here, that this must be an agenda item at COP, because we don't want a discussion at COP27. We want something at COP27. So each year of this 3-year dialogue has to result in something. And I'm sure you would have heard our proposals for what each year can deliver. And the optimism we have and our determination in the lead up to COP. We know the names of the blockers. We want to know what they eat for breakfast. Right? And so we are going to put immense pressure on those blockers in the lead up to COP27. And that pressure is going to come from local civil society in those countries. And we've got a plan for that. The other thing that we are planning to do, but hopefully here we will see this materialize, and I'm so happy that with the G77 plus China, we're going to keep pressure on G77 plus China. It was not acceptable to us at the start of this Bonn session, coming out of your strong position in Glasgow on this matter, that there were a bit of difficulties at the start. I believe things are getting ironed out. We, as civil society, we're watching the G77 because you're supposed to be the ones that's championing this issue of loss and damage. And especially when we're going to Africa and have an African COP, and we've heard what the science says is one of the most vulnerable regions, G77 plus China must stand united around vulnerable people and communities across the world. That's the mandate. So we're determined, we're optimistic, and we're going to win this. And we're going to win it within a 3-year period, not after the 3-year period of dialogue. And so we look to support you in the efforts that you have, and we look to the bigger movement support for this, but we are ready to work, we're working, and we are going to win the fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Ambassador Nabil, we would like to multiply this ambition with yours so that we have a lot more ambition for COP27. So, your ambition and civil society's ambition. I'm really happy to have Ambassador Adao Barbosa from Timor-Leste, who is from least developed country grouping and has been championing this issue for a very, very long time and has been fighting for it. And we know alongside AOSIS and Africa, LDCs have played such an important role, and they are the ones who are suffering the most. And I know, Adao, you were in intense negotiations. Thank you very much for taking out time to be with us for a few minutes. But yeah, we had a very good discussion on what happened, what's the road ahead, and we also shared our proposal as we shared with you in our discussions. We would really like to see progress here in terms of agenda, in terms of capturing what happened at Glasgow Dialogue and the road ahead. So yeah, if you would like to share a few words on how important it is for us and what role civil society can play, and do you think we have been of any use to you from the outside and also from the inside?
Thank you very much, Harjeet, and good afternoon, Excellencies, friends and colleagues. I could start from how party established the WIM itself in 2013. One of the functions of the WIM is action and support. And then we established EXCOM. I was part of the EXCOM for 2 terms, 6 years. That is only second layer of negotiation process. It's very difficult. That's why we need to give this opportunity back to parties to decide how could we address finance for loss and damage. I think that's why G77 and China, all developing countries, were working very hard in Glasgow to establish financial facility for addressing loss and damage. So that's why we are here. So how to move forward? At the moment, it's very difficult. We have 2 mechanisms in place. First one is a dialogue itself. Second one is agenda. And I think agenda is very difficult to be adopted. But dialogue is also still taking place. So we are hoping that our partners can be quite flexible enough, in terms of humanity, solidarity, and also principle-based, historical responsibilities and, polluter-based principle. It's also very important for them. And we could try to establish financial facility by bringing this dialogue into negotiation process, into formal negotiation process under SBI and under COP and CMA to take decision how to get facility for facilitating financial support for addressing loss and damage. Up to date, there is no financial support for addressing loss and damage. So that's why, as developing countries, LDC is also part of them, we are asking to get that facility. And moving ahead, I think it's quite difficult for us to get the process that we are aiming to get it at next COP, but I think at least some formal process will be agreed by the COP and CMA to recognize that this facility is critically important. So the COP and CMA hopefully will provide further mandate to the SBI and SAPSA somehow to facilitate negotiation further. And then by next SBs and COP and CMI, they can also provide further mandate to get more clear modalities and process how to take this facility issue into the mode of negotiation process, so that not next COP, but by the next 2-3 years, we can get it. But for us, we need to get it urgently. But if we are facing difficulties, and then we can get the process first, and we go slowly, and we need to have a decision at COP 28 or 29. We need to have that. I also do agree with my colleagues who said before me that we need to get it process first, and then substantive issues will be later. But we also do believe that negotiation process on how to bring this facility issue into the process of negotiation will be in parallel with dialogue itself. So by 2024, if we finalize the dialogue, report of these dialogues will be providing recommendation to the CMA or COP, both, to address this issue. At least by 2024, something needs to be established. So from now up to 2023, we can discuss about the process. But 2024, something needs to be formalized and to be established to address financial facility for loss and damage. I think this is how we could, address the current needs of developing countries. We are very vulnerable. In terms of capacities, I know LDCs are having limited capacity to address losses and damage arising from the impact of climate change that they are facing at the moment. So this is how we are, and we also look forward to get more support, technical and also political support from civil societies like you all, and also academia. Scientific communities are also critically important to play important role to provide us that tomorrow will be worse. We need to act now. We need to decision on process now, and then we need to establish it in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adao. I think that was also a good closing comment that we need it now, and we're also out of time. But I must mention that when Adao is sharing his frustration, I've been to almost all ExCom meetings, and I've seen how Adao and his fellow ExCom members have been pushing, and rich countries did not even allow it to be put on the agenda, the issue of loss and damage finance. That's how you saw us chanting and shouting outside, put loss and damage on the agenda. So imagine while people are suffering on ground, they're losing homes, they're losing their income, we are fighting it to be even on the agenda so that we can discuss and create something more substantive and bridge the gap that's there in the financial architecture. So as Adao said, we'll fight for it. We need it now. And you heard from Tasneem, as Climate Action Network, as civil society, working with our allies, we're going to make sure that we get it. We have a very clear roadmap, because that's exactly what developing countries, vulnerable communities need at this very moment. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for all your inputs and support, and thank you very much to the panelists.
Italian Climate Network, no? No. Sí.
Una foto de los panelistas.
Gracias.